I remember the letter as if it were still wet with ink, the crisp official stamp of the Reich Ministry of Aviation at the top, the text precise, promising opportunity, responsibility, and a chance to serve the fatherland. Dr. Ernst Keller, it read, "Your expertise in aeronautics and propulsion is urgently required at the Peenemünde Army Research Center. You are to report immediately." I had spent the better part of 5 years buried in wind tunnels and combustion chambers at the Technische Hochschule in Berlin, my mind consumed with theoretical calculations and the elegant precision of German engineering. Yet the reality of the summons unsettled me. Something in the tone hinted at urgency, and urgency in Hitler's Germany often carried shadows I was not yet ready to comprehend. Peenemünde, when I finally arrived in the damp Baltic air of late spring 1937, I was struck by the scale of it all. The facility sprawled across the narrow strip of land on Usedom Island, a collection of concrete bunkers, wooden barracks, and experimental hangars that smelled of salt, oil, and ambition. The sound of diesel engines and the whine of electric motors accompanied every step. Soldiers in Luftwaffe grey patrolled the perimeter, their rifles slung casually, yet always alert. And then there were the scientists, some like me, young and idealistic, others older, grizzled, carrying the weight of prior wars and the certainty of their own genius. It was here that I met Wernher von Braun for the first time. He was taller than I expected, his posture stiff, eyes bright and calculating behind round spectacles. "Dr. Keller," he said, voice polite but clipped, "welcome. Your work on axial compressors could prove invaluable to our rocket projects." I tried not to let my awe show, though my hands shook slightly at the handshake. Von Braun spoke of V2 development with a blend of excitement and quiet obsession, of a vision that could put Germany at the forefront of rocket technology. I nodded, the air thick with technical jargon I had been trained to understand, but could scarcely imagine being implemented on such a scale. Even in those early days, whispers of the larger context reached me. Hans Kammler, a figure of increasing influence, visited occasionally. I learned he wielded authority with ruthless efficiency, a shadow over the facility, ensuring that every delay, every failed experiment would be noted and punished. There were discussions about the Luftwaffe's expectations, about long-range capabilities and the political value of miracle weapons. Occasionally engineers like me would meet in dimly lit corners, discussing the moral implications of what we were building, and quickly silence would follow. One could not risk too much candor. Walls, after all, have ears. The work itself was intoxicating. In the engine testing halls, the roar of liquid fuel rockets filled the air like the roar of a living beast, vibrating the floors and rattling nerves. I spent hours analyzing combustion instability, nozzle erosion, and cryogenic propellant management. There was an elegance to the physics, a brutal, dangerous elegance, but also a gnawing tension. Each successful test was celebrated quietly among us engineers, yet outside the world was changing. Reports of political purges, of arrests within the party, seeped into our discussions in hushed tones. Some colleagues vanished, their desks left untouched, and we spoke only in murmurs. Evenings were the hardest. The barracks were crowded, cold in the early spring nights. I found myself wandering along the coast, staring at the grey water of the Baltic, trying to reconcile my growing pride in our technical achievements with the creeping unease in my chest. What was the purpose of these machines if not to serve a regime increasingly defined by fear and ambition? I told myself it was for science, for the future, for Germany, but the shadows in the hallways, the silent guards, and the ever-watchful eyes of the party reminded me that the line between progress and complicity was razor-thin. There was a small comfort in the camaraderie among engineers. We spoke of aerodynamics, of flight tests, of theoretical space planes that might one day leave the Earth's atmosphere. Alexander Lipich's work on delta wing gliders was discussed with fascination. Kurt Tank's experimental aircraft promised to revolutionize aerial combat. Yet the political climate hung over every calculation. Even a failed experiment was not merely a technical setback. It could become a political liability, and in Kammler's world, liability was deadly. I remember one evening distinctly. The sky was bruised with the colors of dusk, clouds drifting across the Baltic horizon. Von Braun and I stood on the observation deck of a testing hall, watching the flicker of a newly ignited engine. "Ernst," he said quietly, "we are building the future. But you must understand, this future has a weight. Not all will see it as progress." I nodded, unable to respond. He didn't need to say more. In that moment I understood. I had crossed a threshold. I had joined a project that would define not only the war but the ethical landscape of my own life. And so my work began in earnest. Days bled into nights of calculations, assemblies, and test firings. Every successful launch was a triumph, every failure a lesson, and every day a reminder of the perilous tightrope we walked between ambition, obedience, and conscience. Peenemünde was a world apart, a crucible where genius and terror intertwined. I was perhaps the last engineer who still believed that science could exist in isolation from morality, and even that belief would soon be tested. The first winter at Peenemünde was colder than I had imagined. The Baltic winds cut through even the thickest coats, and the smoke from diesel generators left a permanent residue on our skin and lungs. Yet inside the engine halls, the air was alive with the promise of speed and fire. By the end of 1938, I had become fully absorbed in the V2 rocket project, or A4, as it was still officially designated. The work was intoxicating, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. Each launch, each test, carried not only the weight of engineering success but also the looming shadow of the Reich's political ambitions. The technical challenges were immense. Liquid fuel rockets, we learned quickly, were not obedient machines. Combustion instabilities, irregular fuel flow, and nozzle erosion threatened every prototype. I spent hours poring over calculations for turbopumps, cryogenic fuel mixtures, and guidance gyros. My notebooks were filled with equations that seemed more like incantations, each one a fragile bridge between theory and destructive reality. Even minor miscalculations could cause an engine to explode, taking with it both valuable hardware and potentially lives. I worked closely with von Braun, whose vision of a long-range rocket capable of delivering payloads hundreds of kilometers was both mesmerizing and chilling. He spoke often of the mathematical purity of flight, of how a missile was merely a manifestation of physics and human ingenuity. Yet behind his enthusiasm, I began to sense the pressure of political oversight. Kammler's inspections became more frequent, his questions sharper, his patience thinner. There was talk of the Luftwaffe wanting to see practical demonstrations sooner rather than later, of Hitler growing impatient with conceptual toys that had no immediate impact on the war. The first test launches were chaotic. The ground shook, flames roared, and sometimes the rockets simply fell back onto their launch frames. I remember one particular evening when a prototype, nicknamed Project Morgenstern, exploded just seconds after ignition. The blast tore the concrete launch pad apart, scattering debris across the frozen ground. The entire team froze, staring at the ruin, and then scrambled to ensure no one was injured. I felt a knot in my stomach, not at the loss of material which could be replaced, but at the realization of what these machines could become if perfected. Despite these dangers, Peenemünde had a strange rhythm. Days were filled with calculation, assembly, and testing. Nights with lectures, discussions, and quiet debates about the moral implications of our work. Some engineers were already beginning to rationalize their roles. The rockets were not meant to kill civilians, they said, but to serve as deterrents, instruments of precision that could end the war swiftly. I was less certain. The closer our designs came to functioning reliably, the more I feared their potential. How easily could ambition and ideology twist our creations into tools of terror? By late 1939, the world outside Peenemünde had shifted. Hitler's invasion of Poland in September had made war unavoidable. Our work, once abstract, was now clearly tied to destruction. Orders came through with increasing urgency. We were to accelerate development, to prepare for deployment, to ensure that these weapons could be used effectively. I was asked to consult on the rocket's aerodynamics under combat conditions, a task that made my stomach tighten. Each calculation of trajectory, of speed, of payload now had a deadly purpose. Interactions with military officers became tense. I recall a visit from an SS liaison who questioned our testing protocols. He had no technical knowledge, but seemed to sense whether our numbers promised success. The implicit threat hung in the air. Failure would not only mean delay, but punishment. I felt a creeping paranoia settle over me and my colleagues. We whispered our concerns behind closed doors, aware that our notebooks and conversations were never entirely private. Some engineers became silent, others bitter, and a few, those who were overly ambitious, began currying favor with Kammler, suggesting improvements that stretched reality, risking both safety and ethics. I also witnessed the first hints of desperation from our superiors. Resource shortages were becoming evident. Fuel was rationed, metals were diverted to the army, and skilled labor was in high demand. Even as our team pushed forward, there were long delays in receiving crucial components. I watched as technicians improvised with substitutes, sometimes with catastrophic results. I could feel the tension building inside the halls of Peenemünde, in the corridors of Berlin, and within myself. Yet amidst the growing moral unease, there were moments of pride. When a V2 prototype finally cleared the launch tower and flew in a straight arc for several kilometers, the exhilaration was almost intoxicating. I felt a brief, almost guilty thrill. Here was proof that human ingenuity could bend the laws of physics, that a dream of controlled flight could become reality. But the thrill was fleeting. I always returned to the question that haunted me. What would become of this knowledge once perfected, once weaponized? By the end of 1939, I knew that my life had changed irrevocably. Peenemünde was no longer a laboratory of abstract experimentation. It was a crucible where ambition, ideology, and human ethics collided. Every calculation, every test, every successful flight carried with it the shadow of consequence. And as the world outside descended into chaos, I realized that my work, the very skills I had once celebrated, could be used to inflict unimaginable suffering. I began keeping a private journal, a record not just of technical details, but of thoughts I dared not voice aloud. I wrote about my fear, my doubts, and my fascination, documenting the uneasy balance of genius and guilt. This journal would become my anchor, a reminder that even in a world consumed by war, even amidst the roar of engines and the cries of ambition, one could cling to conscience, though not without pain. By the spring of 1940, Peenemünde was no longer the quiet outpost of experimentation it had been during my first winters. The V2 program had matured into a relentless cycle of testing, analysis, and recalibration, but my focus was increasingly drawn to other ambitious projects. Among them were the Me-262 jet fighter and the Silbervogel suborbital spaceplane concept. The duality of these endeavors, one grounded in the desperate needs of war, the other in the loftiest dreams of human flight, created a strange dissonance within me, a constant oscillation between exhilaration and dread. The jet program, under the leadership of Kurt Tank and the guidance of Luftwaffe engineers, was mesmerizing in its complexity. Unlike the V2, which ascended in a single fiery arc, the Me-262 required precision in aerodynamics, metallurgy, and propulsion. Turbojets were temperamental, prone to flameouts and structural failure. I spent hours in wind tunnels, calculating stresses on wing roots, airflow around fuselages, and the thermodynamics of jet engines. Each calculation had to be exact. A minor misstep could tear the aircraft apart mid-flight, endangering pilots whose survival would be the final test of our work. I remember vividly the day I first saw a Me-262 prototype taxiing along the Peenemünde runway. Its engines, thin and wailing, emitted a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, sharp, mechanical, alive. Standing there, clipboard in hand, I felt both awe and fear. This machine was elegant, precise, and terrifyingly efficient, designed to dominate the skies of a world already descending into chaos. Yet even as the engineers celebrated, I could not shake the nagging thought, in whose hands would this weapon ultimately fall? While the jet program demanded immediate attention, the Silbervogel project, a concept for a suborbital bomber capable of striking targets across continents, represented the extremes of theoretical ambition. Alexander Lippish's designs fascinated me. He proposed a winged craft, boosted by rocket engines, skipping along the edge of the atmosphere, striking deep into enemy territory before gliding back to a controlled landing. Mathematically, it was elegant. Practically, it was a nightmare. I became immersed in calculating thermal stresses, propulsion efficiency, and re-entry trajectories, scribbling formulas until my eyes blurred. Here, the thrill of pushing physics to its limits was inseparable from the ethical tension. Could such a machine, if realized, make war unimaginably destructive? By mid-1940, Peenemunde's atmosphere had shifted. The V2 launches continued, but political scrutiny intensified. Kammler and SS officials increasingly visited the facility, inspecting every blueprint, every test log, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. Rumors circulated of infighting between the Luftwaffe, Army, and SS over control of projects and personnel. I felt the tension firsthand during meetings where officers debated resource allocation. Who would receive fuel, metal, and labor? Which project would be accelerated and which postponed? The answers seemed driven less by strategy than by ambition, paranoia, and the shift in favor of higher-ups in Berlin. Resource scarcity became more acute. Metals intended for the Me-262 frames were delayed. Fuel for test engines was rationed, and skilled technicians were reassigned to the Eastern Front or drafted into labor battalions. Improvisation became a survival skill. We scrounged, modified, and recalibrated constantly. Every day I was reminded that technical brilliance alone could not overcome the logistical and political chaos of a nation at war. The fragile beauty of our engineering was always at risk of collapse under human error, mismanagement, or sheer scarcity. In the evenings, I began corresponding secretly with colleagues in other facilities, discussing aerodynamics and propulsion, without mentioning political pressures. These conversations were a lifeline, a way to maintain intellectual integrity amidst the moral compromises we face daily. Yet even these exchanges were tinged with fear. Letters were occasionally intercepted, and loyalty to the Reich was scrutinized more rigorously with each passing month. The paranoia was contagious. I often found myself double-checking calculations, not for accuracy alone, but for whether they could withstand scrutiny from officers who lacked any technical understanding. Perhaps the most surreal aspect of this period was the coexistence of these projects. One designed to give Germany a tactical advantage in the immediate war, the other a theoretical leap toward global reach. I felt caught between worlds, translating the elegant math of flight into machines capable of destruction. My nights were restless, haunted by visions of rockets and planes, by trajectories traced not just in equations but in potential devastation. Despite the growing tension, I also found moments of camaraderie. In the workshops and tunnels, we shared meals, brief jokes, and small victories. A turbojet that finally ran without flameout, a V2 that flew cleanly for 2 kilometers, a calculation confirmed that made Silbervogel feel just a little more tangible. These moments reminded me that even in the shadow of war, human curiosity and collaboration could flourish, albeit in ways that were now inseparable from ethical compromise. By the end of 1941, it was clear that our work had entered a critical phase. The Me-262 was approaching operational readiness. The V2 program was expanding with additional launch facilities, and Silbervogel remained a dream on paper, tantalizing but elusive. The pressures from Berlin intensified. The demands of the Luftwaffe, Army, and SS grew sharper, and the moral weight of our work pressed down on me more heavily than ever. I realized that each technical decision I made, from engine tolerances to structural reinforcements, was now a choice with real consequences, a contribution to both human achievement and potential suffering. I wrote once more in my private journal. The paradox of Peenemünde was clear. We were creating marvels, machines that could extend the reach of human capability, yet each success brought me closer to complicity in acts I could scarcely imagine carrying out. The exhilaration of discovery was now inseparable from fear, from guilt, and from the quiet, growing dread that our genius might serve purposes we could not and perhaps should not control. By early 1942, the landscape of Peenemünde had grown harsher, the excitement of invention tempered by the relentless pressures of war. The Luftwaffe was increasingly desperate for solutions to the Allied bombing raids, while the SS and Army vied for control over every Wunderwaffe project. It was during this period that I became involved with the Mistel program, a concept as audacious as it was grotesque. Mistel, the mistletoe composite aircraft, was a brutal hybrid of ingenuity and pragmatism. A fighter plane would be mounted atop a larger, explosive-laden bomber, intended to be guided toward strategic targets and then released as a flying bomb. My role was largely technical, calculating aerodynamic stability during coupling, refining release mechanisms, and ensuring that the guidance systems allowed sufficient precision to destroy bridges, factories, or fortified positions. Yet as I worked on the project, a sense of unease grew. Unlike the elegance of Silbervogel or even the beauty of the Me-262's lines, Mistel was sheer instrumentality, a machine of destruction stripped of nuance, built to exploit fear and inflict devastation. The technical challenges were immense. Coupling two airframes, each designed for independent flight, demanded meticulous attention to weight distribution, control surfaces, and engine thrust. I spent days in the wind tunnels, measuring turbulent airflow between fuselages and tweaking stabilizers until the results matched our calculations. Every test flight felt like a precarious dance on the edge of disaster. Several prototypes crashed, and I would spend nights analyzing wreckage photos, calculating stresses, and redesigning attachment points. Each crash reminded me that human life was subordinate to our experiments. Pilots' fates were daily wagers on our precision, luck, and the limits of engineering. Meanwhile, Peenemunde's environment was becoming increasingly tense. Allied reconnaissance flights and intermittent bombing raids kept us on edge, and rumors of spies within the facility were whispered in hushed corridors. The political infighting reached new heights. Kammler pressed for accelerated V-2 production, Luftwaffe officers demanded operational jets, and army generals sought priority for the Mistel program. Each faction believed it held the key to Germany's survival, and their demands collided in endless meetings that often dissolved into threats and veiled insinuations. My colleagues and I were caught in the middle, tasked with maintaining technical integrity under impossible pressures. Resource scarcity had reached a critical stage. Aluminum for aircraft frames was redirected from Mistel prototypes to the Eastern Front. Fuel for testing Me-262 engines was rationed to a few critical runs, and skilled machinists were drafted into auxiliary units. We improvised constantly, scavenging parts from damaged aircraft, redesigning engines to accommodate substandard materials, and running simulations in lieu of live tests. Even then, nothing felt sufficient. Every day reminded me of the limits imposed not by physics, but by a nation unraveling under the weight of its own ambition. In quieter moments, I found myself observing the human toll of these programs. Pilots, mechanics, and engineers moved like shadows through the workshops, faces etched with exhaustion, eyes hollowed by fear and overwork. Some laughed quietly over small successes, a Me-262 test flight that stayed aloft, a Mistel release that functioned without incident. But the laughter was brittle, fragile. It existed alongside whispered prayers, fleeting glances at letters from home, and silent reckonings with the lives we were shaping, for better or worse. It was during this period that I first interacted extensively with Kurt Tank and other Luftwaffe officers. Tank was brilliant but increasingly irritable, prone to outbursts when tests failed or timelines slipped. I learned to navigate his moods with careful diplomacy, knowing that a misstep could jeopardize our projects, or worse, my own safety. Werner von Braun remained a constant, steady presence, his focus unwavering, his ambition tempered by the practical limits of materials and manpower. Yet even he could not shield us from the political storms that raged beyond the workshops. Amid these pressures, I continued my work on theoretical projects like Silbervogel, scribbling calculations on scraps of paper between Mistel tests. In these moments, I felt the old thrill of scientific curiosity return. The thought of a craft skimming the edge of space, of seeing Earth from beyond its atmosphere, offered a brief reprieve from the moral and technical chaos that surrounded me. But the thrill was always shadowed by a creeping awareness. The further we pushed technology, the further we risked unleashing destruction beyond comprehension. By mid-1942, the Reich's desperation had become palpable. Strategic failures on multiple fronts, coupled with the relentless advance of Allied forces, created an atmosphere of panic. Orders were given with urgency rather than reason. Deadlines became punishments, and technical excellence was measured against political expediency. I found myself making compromises I had once considered unthinkable, substituting materials, accelerating tests, and prioritizing projects not for scientific merit, but for the whims of higher command. Each decision carried a weight that pressed on my conscience, a constant reminder that engineering brilliance could be both a tool and a weapon. In private, I began keeping a journal with growing intensity. I documented technical notes alongside personal reflections. The exhilaration of solving impossible problems, the dread of witnessing the human cost of our work, and the gnawing question of what my contributions would mean for the world. Every entry was a struggle between pride in achievement and fear of complicity. As the year drew to a close, the Mistel prototypes were beginning to demonstrate potential. The Me-262 was inching closer to operational readiness, and the V-2 continued its steady, terrifying progress. Yet the atmosphere at Peenemünde had shifted irreversibly. The scientific utopia I had imagined upon my arrival was gone, replaced by a battlefield of competing priorities, moral compromises, and the ever-present shadow of death, both human and political. I realized, perhaps for the first time, that our work was no longer about exploration or even innovation. It was about survival, strategy, and the terrifyingly thin line between ingenuity and destruction. Every calculation, every test, every flight was a step along that line, and I began to wonder whether any of us could survive the consequences of the choices we were making. By the closing months of 1942, Peenemünde had transformed from a hub of visionary engineering into a fortress under siege, both physically and morally. Rumors of imminent Allied raids had circulated for months, but no warning could prepare us for the first wave of bombs. The night of the attack, the sky above the Baltic shimmered with fiery tracer lines, and the distant rumble of explosions became a relentless drumbeat that echoed through the workshops. I remember standing at the edge of the facility, hands clenched on the cold railing as the horizon burned. Sparks of fire illuminated the faces of engineers and mechanics, etched with panic, disbelief, and grim determination. The first bombs struck the test stands and assembly halls, sending massive plumes of black smoke into the night. For hours, We worked feverishly to salvage machinery, secure volatile fuel tanks, and ensure that prototypes did not become deadly traps. Every action was measured against a ticking clock of destruction. Every delay threatened lives and projects alike. The attacks changed the atmosphere in Peenemünde. Security tightened, inspections became obsessive, and paranoia spread like wildfire. Kammler and his SS overseers were a constant presence, scrutinizing personnel and threatening severe punishment for any perceived failures. The Luftwaffe's officers demanded accelerated timelines, dismissing the dangers of weakened structures or hastily repaired equipment. We, the engineers, were caught in the middle, balancing the technical feasibility of our work with the ever-escalating demands of a regime that seemed increasingly detached from reality. During the raids, I worked closely with Werner von Braun and a handful of trusted colleagues to shield critical documents and prototypes. Every V2 engine, every Mistel release mechanism, every Me-262 assembly plan became a treasure we fought to protect, not out of patriotism, but out of a professional imperative to preserve knowledge. The irony was bitter. Our greatest achievements were being threatened not by technical failure, but by the very war they were designed to influence. Resource scarcity compounded the danger. Steel, aluminum, and precision instruments were diverted to frontline needs, leaving us to improvise repairs with whatever materials remained. The Mistel program suffered setbacks as replacement parts arrived in dribs and drabs. Test flights were postponed only to be attempted with engines operating beyond safe limits. I spent nights recalculating tolerances, converting fuel formulas, and patching control surfaces with a mixture of frustration and dread. Every miscalculation could mean another crashed prototype, or worse, a pilot dead in the wreckage. Morale was a fragile thing. Among my peers, exhaustion and fear mingled with a stubborn, almost defiant pride. When the bombs fell, we joked in muted, nervous tones about the improbability of surviving another raid. When a Mistel flight successfully completed a test run, we celebrated quietly, aware that the next day could bring disaster. Conversations oscillated between technical minutiae and whispered reflections on the futility of our efforts. We were engineers, yes, but increasingly we were witnesses to the unraveling of a nation and the moral decay of a regime that demanded miracles from men who were only human. Amid the chaos, my conscience gnawed at me. Each success in our Wunderwaffe programs, the precise launch of a V2, the incremental improvements in jet aerodynamics, the stabilization of a Mistel composite flight, felt tainted by the destruction it could unleash. I could not escape the knowledge that our work, our brilliance, was inseparable from human suffering. Yet to refuse, to slow production, was unthinkable. Refusal meant punishment, accusation of treason, or worse. I began to dream not of flying machines, but of the ruins of Berlin, of the faces of those who might fall victim to our creations. The raids also brought us face to face with the limitations of secrecy and security. Allied reconnaissance improved constantly. Photographs of our test stands circulated within intelligence circles, and sabotage, though rare, became a constant concern. I began to notice subtle signs of espionage, misplaced tools, altered test readings, whispers in the hallways. The tension among personnel was palpable. Trust became a luxury we could not afford, and suspicion a daily companion. Even von Braun's calm demeanor could not mask the anxiety we all carried. It was during these months that I first encountered Hans Kammler in person, a figure who embodied both authority and menace. His inspections were swift, his questions sharp, and his patience thin. I was introduced as one of the lead engineers for V2 guidance systems, a role that brought both prestige and terror. Kammler made clear that failure would not be tolerated, and yet the demands he placed on us were almost impossible. Each order was a puzzle of engineering, logistics, and politics, leaving us to navigate a labyrinth of expectations under the ever-present threat of annihilation, whether from bombs above or officers around us. By the spring of 1943, Peenemünde had stabilized, though only just. Our laboratories and test stands bore the scars of war, reinforced with makeshift barriers, and personnel moved with a cautious rhythm, always alert to the next alarm. The V2 program resumed with renewed urgency. The Mistral prototypes continued their perilous tests, and the Me-262 was closer to operational deployment. Yet, for all our progress, the thrill of invention was forever shadowed by the knowledge that each achievement might hasten the suffering of thousands. I often found myself staring into the Baltic horizon, reflecting on the paradox of our work. We were artists and scientists, driven by curiosity and ingenuity. Yet every creation bore the potential for unimaginable destruction. Each day became a negotiation between professional pride and moral compromise, a tightrope walk over the abyss of history itself. And I knew with a cold certainty that the choices we made in those months would define not only our careers, but the legacy of every life touched by our inventions. By the end of 1943, Peenemünde had become a crucible. The relentless bombing, the scarcity of resources, and the moral weight of our work had forged us into a cohort of engineers who were technically brilliant, politically cautious, and emotionally frayed. We continued to build, to calculate, to test, but always under the shadow of destruction, aware that our creations were not just machines, but agents of war and harbingers of ethical compromise. By the autumn of 1943, the once experimental sanctuary of Peenemünde was no longer safe. Allied bombings had intensified, leaving destruction and death in their wake. The decision was made to relocate production to the Mittelwerk facility, deep within the Harz Mountains, a vast underground network carved from rock. I remember the day we arrived, a convoy of trucks carrying engineers, technicians, and equipment, winding through mist-laden valleys, our breath fogging in the chill air. The mine shafts loomed ahead, yawning like the mouth of a giant beast, promising both shelter and the oppressive weight of confinement. Mittelwerk was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The tunnels were carved hastily, reinforced with timber and steel, and lined with rail tracks that carried V2 fuselages and components. The air was thick with dust, the hum of machinery and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder and fuel. The underground chambers were dimly lit, the ceilings low, and the passages narrow, leaving no room for comfort or respite. Here the engineering marvels I had once admired were inseparable from suffering. The labor of prisoners, many political detainees and forced conscripts, was the foundation upon which our rockets were assembled. The moral weight of Mittelwerk was immediate and suffocating. Thousands of prisoners toiled under brutal conditions, starvation rations, backbreaking work, disease, and arbitrary beatings. They were watched by SS guards whose presence alone was a constant reminder of the cost of failure. Every day, I passed men whose faces were hollow, their eyes dull, as they lifted engines and welded structures that would one day soar into the skies. The rockets were beautiful in their geometry and precision, yet each V2 carried the shadow of countless human lives, a thought I could neither ignore nor reconcile. My role shifted. Unlike Peenemünde, where I had been primarily designing and testing, here I was managing production lines, troubleshooting mechanical failures under the pressure of impossible deadlines. The V2s had to be completed at a pace that outstripped the available resources, yet demanded perfection. Even minor defects could result in catastrophic failures. I spent long hours inspecting engines, fuel systems, and guidance mechanisms, knowing that every faulty calculation could translate into death, not just for the soldiers on the front, but for the laborers assembling them under duress. The work brought me into regular contact with Wernher von Braun and other senior engineers, who shared my anxiety but were equally determined to maintain production. Discussions were tense. We argued over tolerances, assembly protocols, and the ethics of using forced labor. Von Braun, ever diplomatic, often reminded me that the engineer's duty was to the science, but I found the line between duty and complicity impossibly thin. In quiet moments, I scribbled notes in my journal, documenting the human cost alongside technical achievements, a silent testimony I feared might never be read. Amid this grueling routine, the political dynamics of the Reich infiltrated even our subterranean sanctuary. Kammler's inspections were relentless, his presence suffocating, and he demanded reports that showcased efficiency without regard for human life. Any delay, any defect, risked accusations of sabotage. The fear was constant. Engineers whispered about colleagues who had disappeared after falling afoul of SS scrutiny. I learned to navigate these waters carefully, offering solutions that satisfied oversight, while mitigating risks to workers wherever possible, a precarious balance that demanded both technical skill and subtle diplomacy. Resource shortages continued to plague us. Metals, fuels, and even precision instruments were rationed, leaving me improvising with inferior materials or substituting components in ways that often required creative engineering to maintain safety and functionality. Each compromise gnawed at my conscience. Every V2 that left Mittelwerk carried not only potential devastation for the enemy, but also the marks of desperation, the fingerprints of my own moral hesitation. One of the most haunting aspects of Mittelwerk was the rhythm of death. Illness spread quickly through the tunnels. Accidents were common, from dropped engines to bursts of pressurized fuel. I had witnessed men crushed by falling machinery, and the hollowed eyes of survivors haunted my dreams. Conversations with the prisoners were scarce, brief exchanges in whispers, yet even fleeting moments revealed a resilience that both inspired and tormented me. How could such courage coexist with the horrors they endured, all to fuel a weapon of destruction? Despite the darkness, there were glimmers of purpose in our work. The rockets, once theoretical and fragile, began to take shape with increasing reliability. Test launches from nearby sites showed promise. Trajectories improved, engines performed closer to design expectations, and the V2 slowly approached operational status. Yet each milestone felt Pyrrhic, as the cost in human suffering weighed heavier with each successful flight. I began to understand the paradox that would define my legacy: engineering triumph inseparable from moral compromise. By early 1944, the pace accelerated. The Allies had intensified their bombing campaigns on remaining surface facilities, and the pressure from Berlin was relentless. The V-2 program became not only a technical challenge, but a political weapon. Every successful deployment was touted as evidence of German ingenuity, every failure a liability. I found myself mediating between engineers, SS officers, and labor supervisors, always aware that my decisions could save or cost lives. The subterranean corridors of Mittelwerk were both a laboratory and a prison, a place where history and conscience collided with unforgiving intensity. In quiet moments, I would wander the tunnels alone, listening to the echoes of machinery and distant voices, reflecting on how ambition, ingenuity, and desperation had converged in this underground forge. I realized that survival, once a simple matter of engineering success, had become a complex equation balancing technical precision, political acumen, and moral judgment. Each day at Mittelwerk tested not only my skill but my humanity, and I knew that the choices I made beneath those stone walls would define the engineer and the man I would become. By the autumn of 1944, the war had turned irreversibly against Germany. The Western Front crumbled as Allied forces advanced through France and Belgium, and the Eastern Front was a relentless flood pushing back into Prussia. In the subterranean shadows of Mittelwerk, our rockets continued to roll down assembly lines, yet the sense of purpose that had once fueled us was now tainted by desperation. Engineers whispered about the collapse above ground, the scarcity of fuel and materials, and the ever-present threat of Allied bombers reaching even our mountain fortresses. It was during this period that I was temporarily reassigned to work alongside Kurt Tank on the Me-262 jet fighter program. Unlike the V-2, which was a vertical weapon of terror, the Me-262 represented speed, agility, and technological audacity. Flying jets were once a dream. Now they were a last-ditch hope to slow the Allies' advance. The aircraft was magnificent in design, sleek and threatening, its twin Jumo 004 engines capable of outrunning conventional Allied fighters. Yet for all its promise, it was plagued by shortages of high-temperature alloys for the turbines and by engines that failed after only a few hours of flight. Working with Tank was invigorating yet nerve-wracking. He was a perfectionist, often frustrated by our inability to produce enough engines or maintain quality amid the chaos. I spent long hours inspecting jet engine tolerances, testing airframes, and improvising solutions to compensate for material deficiencies. Each successful test flight was celebrated with cautious optimism. Each failure reminded us of our vulnerability. The Me-262 became a symbol of our ingenuity, but also of the futility and arrogance of trying to reverse a war that had already been lost. Simultaneously, I was involved in conceptual work on the Silbervogel spaceplane, a hypersonic rocket-powered glider capable of suborbital flight. The project was exhilarating, a chance to push human engineering beyond earthly bounds, yet it was detached from the practical realities of war. When I examined the calculations, the immense stresses of re-entry, and the untested fuel systems, I realized it was an impossible dream made tangible only by sheer ambition. Alexander Lippisch, the aerodynamic visionary behind the project, argued passionately for the potential of reaching beyond the planet, a sentiment that inspired me even as the world around us collapsed. The Mistel composite aircraft was another experiment born of desperation, a crude yet deadly combination of fighter and bomber, using a small piloted plane to guide an explosive-laden larger aircraft toward its target. I worked on guidance systems, release mechanisms, and stabilizing the composite structures. Each iteration was a brutal compromise between speed, accuracy, and the chaotic conditions of fuel scarcity and allied interference. Watching the pilots strap into these hybrid aircraft, fully aware of the risks, was a reminder that human courage and human folly were inseparable in this war. Political tensions were reaching a boiling point. Kammler and other SS overseers demanded progress regardless of the cost, while Luftwaffe officers complained about allocation of resources and the impracticality of certain Wunderwaffe projects. Engineers were caught in the middle, balancing technical feasibility with political pressures, often at the expense of human life. Sabotage, whether intentional or accidental, was a constant concern. Every defect could be interpreted as negligence or treachery. I learned to navigate these treacherous waters with a mixture of diplomacy and quiet subversion, safeguarding lives where possible without drawing the attention of those who might see hesitation as disloyalty. The psychological toll of this period was immense. I observed men breaking under stress, collapsing into despair, or resigning themselves to the inevitability of defeat. Sleep was a luxury, rationed in stolen moments, as each day brought new challenges: malfunctioning engines, missing parts, and the constant drone of Allied bombers over distant cities. The tunnels of Mittelwerk, once a place of refuge from air raids, became a claustrophobic theater of anxiety, illuminated by the glow of welding torches and punctuated by the hum of machinery. Yet, amidst the despair, moments of brilliance persisted. I watched a Me-262 perform a near-perfect test flight, its sleek form slicing through grey skies, and for a fleeting instant I felt the old thrill of engineering discovery. Silbervogel sketches began to take on more defined shapes, our calculations promising a future of possibilities that might never be realized. Even the Mistel flights, crude as they were, demonstrated ingenuity that hinted at humanity's capacity to innovate under pressure. At night, alone in my cramped quarters, I grappled with the paradox of creation and destruction. Every engine, every jet, every rocket I helped produce was a testament to human ingenuity, but also an instrument of suffering. I could not ignore the fact that the technological marvels I contributed to would be used to inflict pain, that the same hands that shaped metal with precision also shaped destiny with indiscriminate force. My dreams were haunted by the faces of those whose labor and lives were sacrificed, juxtaposed against the soaring arcs of engines and wings above ground. By December 1944, the war was closing in on all fronts. Resources dwindled further, bombings disrupted supply chains, and the desperation of the Nazi leadership escalated. Yet the Wunderwaffe projects continued, a testament to human ambition amid decay. The V-2s still thundered from launch pads, Me-262s streaked across European skies, Mistel combinations tested on isolated fields, and Silbervogel remained a dream whispered in corridors of concrete and steel. I understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that survival in this maelstrom depended not only on skill, but on navigating the moral and political hazards that accompanied each technical decision. I could not forget the faces of those below ground, the engineers and prisoners alike, who made our work possible. Mittelwerk had become a microcosm of the Third Reich itself. Brilliance intertwined with cruelty, ambition married to desperation, and science entangled with conscience. As the year ended, I realized that the coming months would test us all, not merely as engineers, but as humans, and somewhere deep in the tunnels and test facilities, the seeds of the final secretive project had already begun to take root. The winter of 1945 brought with it a bitter wind that cut through Peenemünde and the remnants of Mittelwerk like the sharp edge of inevitability. The Reich was unraveling faster than any of us had imagined. The Allies pressed from the west, the Red Army surged from the east, and the once commanding structures of power within the Nazi hierarchy were reduced to frantic quarrels and secretive decrees. It was in this atmosphere of fear and chaos that I was summoned to a hidden laboratory beneath the forests outside Nordhausen, a place shrouded in secrecy, guarded not just by soldiers, but by the paranoia of men who had learned that knowledge was a dangerous currency. Hans Kammler, SS Obergruppenführer and the overseer of the Reich's secret weapon programs, met me personally. His pale face was stern, his eyes cold and calculating. He spoke little, only enough to convey urgency. The project he had me join was said to be Germany's last chance, a weapon so powerful, so mysterious, that it could turn the tide even as our cities burned and our armies faltered. Whispers among engineers called it Die Glock, the bell, though no one outside the inner circle knew its purpose. Fuel calculations and test prototypes were shrouded in the same secrecy that had protected Peenemünde from Allied eyes years before. I entered the facility under the cloak of darkness. The laboratory was a cavernous hall of polished steel and shadowed machinery, humming with an almost alien energy. Scientists and technicians scurried like insects, adjusting gauges, calibrating instruments, and recording results that none of us fully understood. The air was thick with ozone and the metallic tang of chemicals. Even our respirators could not mask the sense of something extraordinary unfolding. I was assigned to oversee propulsion systems and energy calibration, though I quickly realized the scale of ambition exceeded even our most advanced wartime projects. The bell itself was unlike any vehicle, rocket, or plane I had ever seen. Its curved form gleamed with polished metal, but it seemed almost otherworldly, as though its purpose was not merely destruction, but defiance of the natural order. I collaborated with a small team, including physicists whose knowledge of exotic metals, high-energy reactions, and centrifugal physics dwarfed my own, yet none of us could grasp the full scope. Even as the work progressed, the moral weight of the project pressed on me. Each night, I walked through the dimly lit corridors of the facility, hearing the distant rumble of artillery, the screams from villages beyond the forests, and the echo of engines testing rockets elsewhere. My hands, trained to shape and measure with precision, were instruments of unknown consequences. I questioned whether the pursuit of knowledge justified the risks when human life and morality were stakes far greater than the calculations on my chalkboard. The pressure was relentless. Kammler demanded results. The Luftwaffe and army representatives quarreled over access and priority. The SS ensured obedience with a subtle menace that suggested a failure might not only cost our careers, but our very lives. Engineers worked in shifts that blurred day into night, often collapsing at their benches from exhaustion, only to be replaced by others in a seemingly endless rotation. Sabotage was whispered about constantly, deliberate, accidental, or imagined. In such a climate, trust was a rare commodity. I also observed the psychological toll on the men around me. Some became obsessed with the bell, seeing in it a path to glory or survival. Others despaired, realizing that even success could mean their work would be used to wreak devastation on a world already shattered by our own hands. I saw fear in their eyes, the subtle twitch of nerves, the silent prayer that we might somehow escape the inevitable reckoning. For my part, I tried to balance curiosity with caution, working diligently while questioning whether any engineer could be absolved from responsibility when the fruits of our labor might unleash unimaginable destruction. Amid these pressures, technical challenges were staggering. The bell required exotic fuels, magnetic stabilization, and precise rotational velocities, all while remaining structurally intact under enormous stress. The tests were unpredictable. Sometimes the device oscillated violently. Other times it emitted strange luminescent glows that set alarms ringing. Each failure brought tension, recrimination, and fear of the SS overseer's wrath. Each success, however partial, felt like a step toward the precipice of human knowledge, where exhilaration was inseparable from dread. Outside the facility, the world was collapsing. Berlin burned as Soviet artillery pounded the city. Munich, Dresden, and countless towns lay in ruins. Civilians and soldiers alike struggled to survive. Rumors of atrocities, executions, and betrayals drifted through the tunnels and labs. We were insulated, but not immune. The knowledge that our work might fall into the wrong hands, or that the war might end before it could even be tested, added a layer of anxiety that seemed to infect the very air. By February 1945, the Allies were closing in on the region, and the future of the bell became uncertain. Kammler's men whispered about relocation to more secure sites, but logistics, fuel shortages, and the advancing front made movement nearly impossible. Each day was a delicate balancing act, advancing the project, surviving scrutiny, and maintaining a veneer of order in an environment that had none. I felt the full weight of historical forces pressing down on us, aware that the outcome of our work, success, failure, or destruction, would be judged not by technical brilliance, but by its human consequences. And so, as the winter deepened and the war's end drew near, I found myself on the cusp of history, caught between ambition and morality, between survival and complicity. The bell loomed like a symbol of everything we had wrought: genius, hubris, desperation, and ruin. In those days, I began to understand that engineering was not merely about equations and materials, but about the fragile human conscience that must navigate the consequences of creation. The spring of 1945 arrived like a storm, relentless and unforgiving. Berlin was a city on fire, both literally and metaphorically. The streets were clogged with refugees, soldiers, and desperate civilians fleeing the relentless advance of the Red Army. The roar of artillery never ceased, and the distant drone of Allied bombers overhead was a constant reminder that the world we had known was collapsing. I arrived in the capital under orders from Kammler, whose authority, like the Reich itself, was fracturing into chaos. I had not seen Berlin since 1943, when the city still held its semblance of order. Now it was unrecognizable. Shattered buildings, smoldering rubble, the acrid smell of burning timber and gasoline filling every street. The elite engineers and scientists had been summoned for what remained of the Reich's most secretive projects, including the bell, the last symbol of our so-called genius. We were now guardians of a knowledge that could not remain in the hands of a vanishing state. Our new site was a subterranean bunker near Tempelhof, reinforced against bombs, but not against the tide of history. The bell was partially disassembled and reassembled here under tighter security. Its metallic surface reflected the dim lighting of the bunker, cold and unyielding. I realized with a sinking heart that the moment of reckoning had arrived. If the city fell, if the Allies captured our work, we could not guarantee it would not be turned into instruments of further destruction. Yet the SS and Kammler insisted on continued testing, desperate for miracles that would not come. The days were filled with tense, sleepless labor. My colleagues worked feverishly, some in denial, some in despair, others in silent panic. Conversations were whispered, often in fear of informants. Rumors circulated about Kammler's plans for evacuation, or perhaps his own disappearance. I had grown wary of the man's motives, his devotion to power overshadowing even his concern for our survival. Each experiment on the bell carried an air of finality. Failures now were not merely technical, they were moral, a testament to hubris at the edge of ruin. Amid the chaos, I encountered Werner von Braun in a brief and tense meeting. He had been evacuated from Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, yet remained deeply involved with the bell's theoretical framework. We spoke quietly in a corridor, glancing over our shoulders at armed SS guards. "Ernst," he whispered, his voice heavy with urgency. "We are scientists, not soldiers. Our work is no longer about Germany, it's about survival. You must choose what to protect." His words sank like stones in my mind. Was survival for the nation, for ourselves, or for the knowledge we had wrought? Outside the bunker, the city's final defense crumbled. The Red Army pressed forward, pounding every street, every intersection, every building that had not yet fallen. The citizens of Berlin endured horrors unimaginable, and the sound of artillery became a constant drumbeat of mortality. The choice facing us was stark: evacuate the bell and risk its capture, destroy it and condemn our work to oblivion, or leave it intact and hope the chaos concealed it. Each option carried consequences that gnawed at my conscience. We had briefings with Kammler and his SS aides, who demanded unwavering obedience, but even they were losing control. Reports of defections, executions, and the disintegration of command filled the bunker. The final orders for the bell's testing were issued amidst confusion, each step carrying the tension of a ticking clock. Our calculations and measurements were precise, but the world outside was anything but. It became clear that no amount of engineering could restore order to a city and a regime teetering on the edge of annihilation. During one late-night inspection, I stood alone beside the bell, listening to the distant bombardment. Its form, metallic and glistening in dim light, seemed almost alive, a monument to ambition, genius, and the shadow of catastrophe. I thought of the thousands of lives spent, both ours and countless others, and I realized that knowledge itself was a burden heavier than steel. In those moments, I wrestled with the duality of creation. the wonder of achievement, and the horror of what that achievement might unleash. The decision came swiftly. Kammler ordered partial evacuation, but fuel and transport were scarce. Soviet forces were encircling the city. I, along with a small team of trusted engineers, made the choice to dismantle key components of the bell, sabotaging its core mechanisms. We worked with precision, leaving traces that would render the device inoperable, but concealing our deliberate acts from the SAS. It was an act of survival, of conscience, of quiet defiance against the ideology that had demanded we build without thought of consequence. On May 1st, 1945, as the sounds of artillery and screaming drew closer, Kammler vanished, along with a portion of his personal staff. Berlin was falling. We fled the bunker in small groups, navigating streets filled with smoke, corpses, and the distant clamor of battle. The bell remained behind, an incomplete and dormant testament to what had been attempted. I walked away from Berlin a different man, an engineer burdened with memories, knowledge, and the indelible stain of complicity. Survival was no victory, it was a responsibility. I had carried the weight of creation, of destruction, and of conscience. And as the Reich collapsed around me, I understood that history would judge not only what we built, but what we chose to preserve or destroy in the end. The war had ended, but its echoes clung to me like shadows that refused to leave. By 1946, I had found a fragile refuge in the quiet town of Göttingen, far from the ruins of Berlin, Peenemünde, and Mittelwerk. The world outside was scarred, yet somehow moving forward, rebuilding amidst the wreckage. For me, however, survival came with a weight that no civilian normality could lift. I was no hero, no victor, simply a man who had lived while others had perished, and who carried knowledge too dangerous, too potent, to forget. I had avoided capture by the Allies partly through luck, partly through the obscure network of colleagues who had, like me, chosen discretion over notoriety. Werner von Braun had already begun navigating his transition into American programs, quietly salvaging what remained of our research for the post-war era. I did not envy him. He was bright, ambitious, and pragmatic, qualities that could survive morally ambiguous times. I, on the other hand, had survived burdened by the memory of choices made in desperation, under orders that had required technical skill and moral compromise in equal measure. The bell, the final enigmatic project we had abandoned in Berlin, haunted me. Its mechanisms, partially dismantled and sabotaged, were left behind, but I knew it was still intact in memory and record. Even today, I am haunted by the knowledge of what might have happened if it had fallen into the wrong hands, or if the Allies had uncovered its secrets. It was an invention of brilliance, yes, but brilliance married to the ideology of destruction. The moral question that had loomed over me in the dark corridors of the Tempelhof bunker now pursued me in the daylight. Could genius ever be neutral when paired with tyranny? I found myself writing, recording every detail I could remember. These memoirs were not intended for publication. They were confessions to myself, to history, and perhaps to the absent souls of colleagues and victims alike. I wrote of Peenemünde, the excitement of our early rocket tests, the camaraderie and rivalries among engineers, the technical triumphs shadowed by political manipulations. I wrote of the Me Too 62 and Mistel projects, marveling at the elegance of engineering even as the destruction they enabled filled my conscience with guilt. Yet writing could not absolve me of the choices I had made. I had followed orders, I had participated in experiments, in designs, in calculations that could have caused untold harm. I reminded myself constantly that at each critical juncture, Peenemünde, Mittelwerk, Berlin, I had the ability to act differently, and yet inaction often seemed impossible. The regime demanded obedience, and the alternative was death or complicity in atrocities far beyond my control. It was a moral paradox I had learned to carry silently, like a second set of lungs, invisible but necessary to survival. As I walked the streets of Göttingen, I often saw children playing, unaware of the shadows cast by the preceding years. I would watch them and feel a bittersweet hope. Perhaps humanity could endure even after the depths of calculated destruction. The same mind that conceived the V2 could one day imagine rockets reaching the stars, if wielded with conscience. And yet I knew that every step forward would always be shadowed by the potential for misapplication. Genius, divorced from ethics, was a dangerous companion. In conversations with local academics, I carefully navigated what I could disclose. The Allies were eager to recruit German expertise, but I declined their overtures, choosing instead a quiet life of observation, reflection, and writing. I occasionally received letters from former colleagues, some in America, some scattered across Europe, all with the same subtext. What we had created could not easily be unseen. We were engineers, bound not only by knowledge, but by the invisible chains of moral consequence. Night after night, I would dream of Peenemunde's launch pads, the rumble of the V2s, the hiss of fuel, the metallic scent of the Mistral composites in assembly halls. The bell, particularly, was a recurring figure in these dreams, rotating, humming, an impossible artifact of both ambition and terror. I would awaken in sweat and silence, acutely aware that survival had not removed me from responsibility. It had merely placed me at the crossroads of memory, conscience, and the uncertain march of history. I sometimes wonder, had I destroyed all my notes, the schematics, the recollections, would the burden feel lighter? Or would ignorance have left me complicit in a different, subtler way? I chose preservation, not to glorify, but to ensure that history remembered the full spectrum of human capability, ingenuity and terror, brilliance and blindness, creation and destruction. It is a record not of triumph, but of caution, a reminder that knowledge is neither inherently good nor evil, but always consequential. As I set down my pen each evening, I understood that survival was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a long reckoning with conscience. The world could rebuild, and some could rise above their past. But for those like me, the past would never be fully behind us. It lived in memory, in reflection, in the quiet horror and the fleeting hope that one day the lessons of genius and ambition, of choice and consequence, might prevent the same errors from repeating. History would judge us all, not solely by what we built, but by what we chose to preserve, to destroy, and to remember. And in that judgment I found the slenderest solace, that knowledge, wielded with reflection, could still be a tool for understanding, even if it had once been an instrument of devastation.